On a perfect, almost achingly beautiful late summer morning in early September 2001, a day of seemingly infinite visibility, one man later said, characterized by the rare and exquisite flying conditions airline pilots call severe clear. Life in New York and much of the rest of the contemporary world was changed irrevocably in the space of less than 2 hours. In a little less than 2 hours, with an almost poetically horrifying symmetry, the symbols and instruments of the city's uniquely air-minded culture and of globalization itself, skyscrapers, jets, and the mass media, would be turned back against themselves with a devastatingly lethal impact and effect. By 8:55, an army of firemen, police officers, emergency medical personnel, and government officials, including the mayor himself, had begun to descend on Lower Manhattan, along with an army of reporters, photographers, and television crews, as the machinery of the largest media apparatus in the world began to focus on the 16-acre site. At 9:02 a.m., little more than 15 minutes after the attack, millions of people in the metropolitan region, and tens of millions more across the country and around the world, were staring intently at the smoldering skyline of Lower Manhattan, when a dark shape appeared on the horizon above the New Jersey lowlands and came hurtling across the upper bay. The second plane had struck the South Tower at 9:02:54 a.m., just 16 minutes after the first plane went in. By then, the first teams of firemen and rescue workers had already arrived at the foot of the North Tower, where they were greeted by a scene of horror and devastation that defied the imagination. On the Austin Tobin Plaza, there were corpses everywhere. The mangled bodies of men and women who had already jumped or fallen from the upper floors of the building, and the charred remains of passengers from Flight 11, some still belted into their seats. Far above, meanwhile, in the upper reaches of the towers themselves, the gaping black holes where the planes had gone in marked a stark dividing line between life and death.
One of the most horrific scenes in the history of the nation took place 1,000 feet above Lower Manhattan. And it took the lives of people who were staring down at safety, at the most populous city in the nation, civilization at its peak. But they didn't have anywhere to get there. And there's really few words to describe how terrible that must have been.
By 9:30, ordinary life had all but ceased across the city, as millions of New Yorkers and hundreds of millions more around the world looked on in shock and disbelief at the nightmarish images unfolding in real time on TV.
You usually can gauge things, within a few minutes, so that they may start getting worse. But at one time you say, well, this is what they are. But this was something that started getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse and worse.
At 9:38, word came that terrorists had commandeered a third jetliner and crashed it into the Pentagon, killing everyone on board and 126 people on the ground. And not long after, that a fourth plane had crashed into a hillside in rural Pennsylvania, brought down by some of its own heroic passengers before it could reach its intended target in the nation's capital. And then, on a morning of hideous surprises, already without precedent in the city's history, something happened that no one had ever thought possible before. Something beyond comprehension. Something that had never happened in the history of tall buildings since the first skyscrapers had gone up at the foot of Manhattan over a century before. The floor trusses on the 80th floor of the South Tower began to give way. Columns along the east wall began to buckle outwards, and the entire building began to come down. As the quarter-mile-tall structure dissolved into a massive shroud of smoke and dust, thousands of people in the surrounding streets began to cry out in horror and disbelief, then ran for their lives, pursued by an enormous billowing cloud of dust and debris.
It never occurred to me that these two buildings would come down. So that when they did, it was the most shocking moment maybe that I'd ever had. That the South Tower began to tip forward and then righted itself and came down in what in memory seems like a slow motion moment. It happened in 10 seconds. 10 seconds. It's a knockout in boxing. The whole thing came down. It was just, to me, still, it's a staggering moment in New York, in any history, in world history, for a place that had never had anything like that happen to it ever before. The Empire State Building didn't come down. You couldn't. 93, the 4,000-pound bomb goes off in the basement, doesn't come down. This time it came down. This time they figured it out. And I thought, oh man, something new's happened here.
At 10:28 a.m., 30 minutes after the South Tower fell, the television antenna atop the North Tower began to give way, followed a fraction of a second later by the upper floors of the building itself, as the entire North Tower now came down too. In the end, the 500,000 tons of concrete, steel, glass, and aluminum in each tower had hurtled to the ground in a virtual freefall, traveling at a speed of 125 miles an hour. Shock waves from the twin impacts were picked up more than 40 miles away by seismic instruments used for monitoring earthquakes. The immense columns of rubble and dust drifting away from ground zero could be clearly seen from outer space.
I have to tell you, I didn't know whether the buildings were empty or whether there were tens of thousands of people in them. I just had no idea, and I was totally devastated by the fact that all those people were in there and this building that I had designed was perhaps falling on them. The buildings were not so important to me. I'm good at buildings, but people are another matter. It was a terrible event. Absolutely terrible.
I don't think you can measure the impact. It's absolutely enormous. Everybody felt it, but of course those who felt it most and will never get over the effects are those who lost people. And the sheer numbers are so appalling, and the horror of the attack is so appalling that, in one sense, New York will never be the same.
With the collapse of the second tower, an eerie quiet descended on New York. By 11 o'clock, hundreds of thousands of dazed and disheveled office workers, many covered in ashes and dust, could be seen marching north from the financial district, straggling uptown along the West Side Highway, or heading over the bridges to Brooklyn. Down at the site itself, hundreds of firemen and rescue workers groped their way across a surreal landscape of smoke and flames, at the edge of an immense 7-story pile of tangled steel and debris. searching desperately for any signs of life. All day, doctors and nurses in emergency rooms around the city braced for the anticipated onslaught of injured survivors that never came. Those who got out, one nurse later said. Those who didn't, died.
(10:06 a.m., Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Flight 93 was en route from New Jersey to California with 45 passengers when it went off course at 8:56 over Cleveland, Ohio. According to the official story, Flight 93 was headed for the White House when it was overpowered by a group of passengers and crashed in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Out of all of the events of 9/11, the one that has caused the most confusion is Flight 93. It was shot down, it wasn't shot down. However, evidence suggests that perhaps Flight 93 was nowhere near Shanksville.
I want to get quickly to Chris Kanicki. He's a photographer with the Pittsburgh affiliate of Fox affiliate. He was back there just a couple of minutes ago, and Chris, I've seen the pictures. It looks like there's nothing there except for a hole in the ground.
Basically, that's right. The only thing you could see from where we were was a big gouge in the earth and some broken trees. We could see some people walking around in the area, but from where we could see, there wasn't much left.
Any large pieces of debris at all?
No, there was nothing that you could distinguish that a plane had crashed there.
Smoke, fire?
Nothing. It was absolutely quiet. It was actually very quiet. Nothing going on down there, no smoke, no fire. Just a couple of people walking around. They look like part of the NTSB crew walking around looking at the pieces.
How big would you say that hole was?
From my estimates, I would guess it was probably about 20 to 15 feet long and probably about 10 feet long or 10 feet wide.
What could you see on the ground, if anything, other than dirt and ash? And
you couldn't see anything. You could just see dirt, ash, and people walking around, broken trees.
Wally Miller, a Somerset County coroner, told the Houston Chronicle, "It looked like somebody just dropped a bunch of metal out of the sky." In the Washington Post, "It looked like someone took a scrap truck, dug a 10-foot ditch, and dumped trash into it." And as for the passengers, I stopped being coroner after about 20 minutes because there were no bodies there. In the Pittsburgh Review, I have not, to this day, seen a single drop of blood. Not a drop. It would seem that, on one day, for the second time in history, an entire plane, along with its passengers, disappeared upon impact.
There are no signs of any survivors at the site of a Nigerian plane crash. That is the word from the Red Cross, which has a representative on site. The first pictures of the crash scene show a large crater with the Boeing 737 broken into small pieces. The plane crashed shortly after taking off from Lagos in a heavy storm. The flight was going to the Nigerian capital of Abuja and was believed to be carrying some senior Nigerian officials.
So if Flight 93 didn't go down in Shanksville, then where? You ready for this? Cleveland. At 11:43 on September 11th, WCPO, a local TV station in Cincinnati, Ohio, reported that 2 planes landed at Cleveland Hopkins Airport due to a bomb threat. United Airlines identified one of the planes as Flight 93. Are you confused? Well, it gets better. Check it out. At approximately 10 a.m., Cleveland Hopkins Airport was evacuated amidst rumors that a hijacked plane was going to land. Passengers had to leave, but couldn't drive. They had to walk or hitchhike. Buses weren't allowed to leave. People were sent home. According to Associated Press and local Ohio papers, one plane landed at approximately 10:45. But Delta Airlines confirmed that their plane, Delta 1989, landed in Cleveland at 10:10. Therefore, Flight 93 landed at Cleveland at approximately 10:45. Authorities searched Delta 1989 for over 2 hours, and passengers were questioned individually. The plane dealer reported that the plane was evacuated at 12:30, but the Akron Beacon reports that a plane was evacuated at 11:15, which would make that Flight 93. Mayor White reported that the plane had 200 passengers. but a passenger from Delta 1989 describes 60 or so passengers. So at 11:15, 200 or so passengers were released from Flight 93. The passenger from Delta 1989 states that she was taken into FAA headquarters, but other reports say that passengers were brought into the NASA Glenn Research Center, located near the west end of the airport, which had already been evacuated. So, to sum up, Delta 1989 landed at 10:10, was evacuated at 12:30, almost 2.5 hours later, and 69 passengers were taken to FAA headquarters. Flight 93 landed at 10:45 and evacuated within a half hour. 200 or so passengers quickly taken to an empty NASA research center.
One question becomes inevitable at this point. What happened to the passengers? With certainty, no one can answer this question. One thing we do know, however, the CIA has been developing plans for covert operations that involve the in-flight swapping of commercial airliners with military drones since the 1960s. One such plan was called Operation Northwoods, and it detailed how to replace a civil airliner with a military drone in mid-air, unbeknownst to the air traffic controllers. After the swap, the airliner would be landed in a military base. The drone would continue to fly, appearing on radar as the original plane, and would be remotely guided all the way into the target. We don't know whether this is the actual end the passengers met, but one thing we can say for sure: those who called their relatives from their cell phones could not have placed those calls from the airplanes in flight. Minutes after the fourth plane had crashed in Pennsylvania, news was already circulating that several passengers had made calls with their cell phones from the hijacked airplanes.
"We are being hijacked. We are being hijacked." Those frightening words were uttered by a passenger aboard United Flight 93 who was able to call emergency personnel on his cell phone before the plane crashed in western Pennsylvania.
And tonight we're getting reports of cell phone calls from at least 3 of those 4 flights. On the second flight that came out of Boston, that was the second flight of the day and also went into one of the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, there was a businessman who got off 2 cell phone calls to his father.
The CNN commentator Barbara Olson, wife of U.S. Solicitor General Ted Olson. She reportedly called her husband twice on a mobile phone to tell him her plane was being hijacked.
The problem is that in 2001, it was practically impossible to make a call with a cell phone from an airplane at cruising altitudes. The whole idea behind cellular phones is that they use low power transmitters, both to keep the cost of the units down and to preserve battery life. It is up to the receiving towers on the ground to pick up and boost their signal before they route it through the system. It is commonly thought that beyond 10,000 feet in altitude, most cell phones become useless. Passenger planes normally cruise at 30,000 feet and beyond. The editors of Popular Mechanics, however, maintain that cell phones do work from cruising airplanes, even at maximum altitudes.
David Dunbar.
With regard to the cell phones, we did what any reporter would do. We talked to experts in the field, and in fact, cell phones do work at that altitude, up to 35,000 feet and higher. And
in 2001?
In 2001, and it might be instructive for you to talk to some of the cell phone experts.
Instead of talking to experts, Japanese television decided to take matters into their own hands. In 2003, they conducted an on-camera experiment near Ontario, Canada, to verify the actual reach of cell phones from different altitudes.
The cellular phone system used in the experiment in Canada is the one used in the United States. 3 cell phones, each from different telephone companies, were used. The experiment begins at 1,000 feet.
Hello?
Hello, I'm calling from cell phone A. What's up? Sounds okay?
The results were the same with the other 2. Next, we went up to 4,000 feet. Then...
No, not on me.
Company B's phone stopped working at 4,000 feet. And when the aircraft rose to 6,000 feet, Company A's phone also became useless. At 8,000 feet, none of the 3 cell phones worked anymore.
No service on A, no service on B, no service on C.
In other words, at an altitude of 35,000 feet, cell phones would have been totally useless.
There is another problem besides altitude that makes calling from a cell phone unthinkable from a cruising airplane, and that is speed. Calling from an aircraft with a cell phone would be like calling from a car traveling at 500 miles per hour. The connection would continuously need to be transferred from one receiving station to the next, and then to the next, and again to the next. The transfer procedure between two receiving stations is called handoff, and it relies on continuous triangulations between the receiving towers in order to establish the exact position of the caller. As the mobile unit approaches the handoff zone, the first tower senses the weakening of the signal and prepares to transfer the call to the second. When the second tower senses the signal is strong enough to take over, the handoff procedure is initiated. If everything goes well, the call is rerouted into the system by the new receiving station. But the speed by which an airplane approaches and crosses over the handoff zone is so high that the towers wouldn't have the time to complete the handoff procedure. The call would be dropped, and the person would need to dial the number from scratch. If one considers the altitude and the speed problems combined, it should be clear that the chances of having an actual conversation with a cell phone from a cruising airplane are practically nil. Even after 2001, both altitude and speed problems remain. In 2005, the Washington Post wrote, "Most cell phones can't reach a station from beyond 10,000 feet. Another technical hurdle is to find a way that cell phone calls would be handed off from one cell tower to another on the ground when an aircraft is traveling at 500 miles an hour." And even 10 years after 9/11, people who try to use their cell phone from cruising altitudes are bound to get the same results. Once it became clear that the passengers could not have placed their calls from the cell phones on the airplanes, the official narrative on this issue became more and more ambiguous and non-committal. Theodore Olson, who had initially told the press he had received 2 cell phone calls from his wife Barbara, changed his story to calls made from an airphone. And by the time the 9/11 Commission published their final report, only one mention on the cell phone calls remained. Shortly thereafter, wrote the Commission, passengers and flight crew began a series of calls from GTA airphones and cellular phones. No indication on which calls were made from cell phones and which ones with airphones was given. The authorities from the Moussaoui trial also avoided being too specific on the origin of the calls. Within the official documentation, they released this flash animation, which contains all the basic information on the 4 hijacked airplanes. By clicking on any of the flights, one can view the passengers list. By clicking on the telephone icon at the bottom, the passengers who have made phone calls are highlighted. And by clicking on any of the passengers' names, the list of the calls they have made is displayed. Each of the calls lists the exact time it was placed, the duration, the initial part of the number dialed, and the name of the person receiving the call. But the number from which the phone call was placed is missing. The only information available is the location on the plane the calls were presumably made from, row 30 in this case. It's as if the authorities were trying to suggest that the calls were made from airphones without having to put it down on paper. Only in 2 cases did the authorities openly state that a cell phone was used. One is the call allegedly placed to 911 by a passenger who had locked himself in a lavatory where airphones are not available. The second is a call placed by flight attendant CeeCee Lyles to her husband, who later described his surprise in receiving a call from her cell phone in a television interview.
Once the phone got disconnected, then I sat up in the bed like, it was like I just woke up. I'm like, was that a real call? So I looked at the caller ID and noticed that it was a call, and it was from her cell phone. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute. How can she call me from on the plane from a cell phone? Because cell phones don't work on a plane. That's what I'm thinking.
As only these 2 phone calls were admitted by the authorities, the debunkers have universally adopted the only 2 cell phone calls made position.
Le telefonate non sono state fatte con i cellulari, sono state fatte con gli earphone. In soli 2 casi è stato usato un cellulare, quindi quelle 2 telefonate brevissime, frammentarie, sono state fatte quando l'aereo era una quota perfettamente compatibile con la rete cellulare americana.
But one thing is the number of cell phone calls admitted to. Another is the number of calls that were actually made. In the days following 9/11, the FBI interviewed the various people who had received a phone call from their relatives on the planes, and their reports tell a different story. One of the reports reads, starting at approximately 6:30 Pacific Standard Time, which is 9:30 New York time, Dina Burnett received a series from 3 to 5 cellular phone calls from her husband, Thomas Burnett. Burnett was able to determine her husband was using his own cellular phone because the caller ID showed his number. Only one of the calls did not show the caller ID as she was on the line with another call. According to the official documentation, Thomas Burnett made a total of 3 calls, one at 9:30, one at 9:37, and one at 9:44. This means that at least 2 of these calls, if not all 3, were made from Burnett's cellular phone. At 9:30, the plane was flying at 32,000 feet and climbing. At 9:37, it had reached 36,000 feet and was still climbing. At 9:44, it had descended to 22,000 feet, while it accelerated until reaching a ground speed of almost 400 miles per hour. None of these calls seems to have been possible with a cell phone from that airplane. According to another report, United 93 passenger Jeremy Glick saw hijackers on the plane, used a cell phone, and called Makeley, his stepmother, to report the hijacking. He then asked to talk to his wife, Lisbeth.
And he was on the phone and he had told me that his plane had been hijacked.
According to the FBI, Glick's wife, Lisbeth, could not hear any unusual sounds in the background of the call, and the connection was extremely clear, as if he was calling from the next room. Cell phone communication was lost at 9:55. Glick placed the call at 9:37, which means the communication lasted uninterrupted for 18 minutes while the plane was flying between 39,000 and 10,000 feet at an average speed of almost 400 miles per hour. Only a miracle could have kept that connection open for all that time had the call truly been placed from the airplane in flight. Lauren Grancolas possessed a cellular phone and is believed to have allowed another passenger, Honor Wainio, to use the cellular phone. Wainio placed one call to her parents at 9:53, when the plane was at about 10,000 feet, traveling close to 400 miles per hour. Elsa Strong received a cell phone call from her sister, Lisa Gronlund, a passenger on United 93. Gronlund made the call to her sister at 9:46, when the plane was at 17,000 feet and traveling at almost 400 miles per hour. Marion Britton was also a passenger on United 93. Britton's live-in boyfriend received a cellular phone call from Britton during the hijacking. Britton told Fiumano, her boyfriend, that she had borrowed a cell phone from another passenger. Britton's call to Fiumano took place at 9:49, when United 93 was flying beyond 13,000 feet at a speed of 420 miles per hour. Peter Hansen, a passenger on United 175, contacted his mother on cell phone and said the flight had been hijacked. Peter's father, Lee, said that he resisted the temptation to call his son back because he didn't want to place him in more danger by having his cell phone ring on the plane. Peter Hansen called his parents twice, at 8:52 and at 9 a.m. At 8:52, the plane was at 30,000 feet and it was climbing. At 9 o'clock, it was flying at over 18,000 feet in altitude, while it accelerated towards the record-breaking speed of almost 600 miles per hour near sea level. Brian Sweeney was also a passenger on United 175. After learning of the attacks, wrote the FBI, his wife Julie Sweeney returned home to find that her husband had left a message made from his cell phone aboard the plane on their answering machine. Sweeney made the call at 8:58 in between the 2 Hansen calls, when the plane was still at 25,000 feet in altitude. While any one of these phone calls could have momentarily been connected by a set of fortunate coincidences, it should be obvious that all these cell phone calls as a whole could not have been made from the cruising airplanes. Question: given the known limitations of the cellular phone system in 2001, can you provide any evidence that the cell phone calls made by the passengers reported by the FBI could have been made from the altitudes, at the speeds, and for the durations indicated for each of them? We do know, however, that the calls were made, as no one has ever doubted that the relatives actually received them. This opens the way to a disturbing possibility, which seems to support the in-flight swap hypothesis, that the passengers were forced to call their relatives under duress, pretending to be on the airplane, while in fact they had already been landed in some unknown location. In support of this hypothesis, we have different elements. One is the conversation passenger Todd Beamer had with a GTA airphone operator, Lisa Jefferson, during the hijack of Flight 93. It is through Lisa Jefferson that the whole world learned about the famous call to action, "Let's roll."
When he told the guys, "Are you ready?" I assumed that they were waiting on his cue. Then they responded to him, and he said, "Okay, let's roll."
The 9/11 Commission has established that the hijack took place at 9:28. Todd Beamer was connected to Lisa Jefferson at 9:43, some 15 minutes into the hijacking. The FBI report confirms that Jefferson received the call from Beamer at approximately 8:45 Central Time, which is 9:45 Eastern. But the contents of the conversation are strikingly at odds with the official narrative. According to Jefferson, Beamer called to state that the plane was about to be hijacked. He stated that 3 individuals, 2 wielding knives, the third with a bomb strapped to his waist with a red belt, were preparing to take control of the flight. Jefferson estimated that she spoke to Beamer for 7 minutes before the 2 hijackers armed with knives entered the cockpit. This places the hijacking at around 9:52, while officially it took place at 9:28. This is no small discrepancy. How could Beamer be describing events that are supposed to be happening in front of his eyes, when in fact they had already happened half an hour before? How could the terrorists be preparing to take control of the flight at 9:45 when they had already been in the cockpit for more than 15 minutes? The FBI also wrote that Jefferson noted that the call had an unusually low amount of background noise, the same thing Liz Glick had noticed. Furthermore, the records show that Beamer's call lasted roughly 1 hour and that the line was left open after the crash. "We didn't lose a connection," stated Jefferson, "because there's a different sound that you use. I never lost connection. It just went silent." Jefferson stayed on the phone, stated the FBI, until she learned Flight 93 had crashed. Question: since airphones are powered by the same airplane's electrical system, how could the line have remained open for another 45 minutes after the plane had literally disintegrated to the ground in 1,000 pieces? All these discrepancies seem to suggest that Beamer was not on the plane, observing real events unfolding, but was describing an imaginary, pre-scripted situation from a different location. In support of this hypothesis, we also have the dramatic message left by flight attendant CeeCee Lyles in her husband's answering machine before briefly talking to him on her cell phone. As she herself is suggesting, we should listen very carefully.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that.
We too can notice the absence of the typical background noise heard inside a plane.
I don't know what to say. There's 3 guys. They've hijacked the plane. I'm trying to be calm.
After saying goodbye, she seems to fumble with the headset while she whispers a few more words into the mouthpiece.
I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
End of message.
Even by playing the segment several times, it remains difficult to hear anything different from the words, "It's a frame." In any case, the problem with the phone calls does not change. The cell phone calls confirmed by the FBI in their reports cannot have been made from the cruising airplanes. Someone has to explain where they came from.
Cell phones, hey, they're terrific, they're wonderfully convenient, and we often use them. But something you may not have known is that when you use a cell phone, it's not only the call that's being made, but that phone is providing information you may not have been aware of. And that brings us to this week's case. It involves a murder prosecution in Iowa. There was a fellow accused of murder, and the prosecution attempted to get in cell phone records that indicated that a phone call was made, which of course all phone records indicate that, but additionally those records from a cell phone that showed where generally the call was made from. And the purpose of that was to show that the call was made from the location generally where the murder took place. Now, the lawyers on behalf of the fellow who was accused said, no, you can't get those in. Now, this may sound a little strange. What they contended is that there was a lack of foundation. They said that the records that were being used to demonstrate where the call was made from were not regular records, that they had been put together just for the trial and therefore they weren't really trustworthy. When it went up on appeal, the court looked at it and they considered this and they said, no, wait a second. These are normal records maintained by the cell phone company in order to send out bills and just generally determine what's happening on the traffic on the various cell phone towers. As all of us are aware, the cell phone calls are made utilizing cell phone towers that we often see around. And what was done in this instance is the engineer was able to look at those records and say, hey, that was the tower that was used for that cell phone call. This was the other tower that it was used. And based upon that, I can tell you that the phone call was made from generally this location. Okay, based upon that, the fellow was convicted of murder.
Worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I wanna.
Tuesday, 9:47 a.m.
Hi, baby. Baby, you have to listen to me carefully. I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. I'm on the plane. I'm calling from the plane. I want to tell you I love you. Please tell my children that I love them very much. And I'm so sorry, babe. I don't know what to say. There's 3 guys. They've hijacked the plane. I'm trying to be calm. We're turned around, and I've heard that there's planes that's been flown into the World Trade Center. I hope to be able to see your face again, baby. I love you. Bye.
End of message.
Worn out places, worn out faces, bright and early for their daily races, going nowhere, going nowhere. Their tears are filling up their glasses, no expression, no expression. Hide my head, I wanna drown my sorrow. No tomorrow, no tomorrow. And I find it kinda funny, I find it kinda sad. The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had. I find it hard to tell you, I find it hard to take. When people run in circles, it's a very, very mad